very short lesson on a very, very beautiful poem in English literature. The name of the poem is To the Fair Clarinda, and it is written by Ben. So it is, I think, a nice thing to know a little bit about who the person is who has written the literary work that you are going to study, going to read, or going to enjoy, because it gives you an idea about the person or the kind of individual that was behind the literary work which has been produced. So we will start off by learning a little bit about who Ben was. Now, Ben was born in England in 1640, and she was possibly born to a barber and a wet nurse living in Kent. Now, don't confuse yourself as to why the word possibly has been used, because the explanation is here in this slide in itself. Ben has peculiarly been resistant to biographical readings because not much is known about her personal life, not much is known about the kind of person she was. Not a lot of detail is available about her personal life, so most of the ideas that we have about this personal aspect of her life comes from haphazard facts which are available from a number of sources. Anyways, in her youth, she undertook spying missions for Charles II, returned to London in the late 1660s, and began to make a living by writing plays for the Duke's Theatre. And later, she started to produce prose fiction, poetry, and translations. Now, the most peculiar thing and the most interesting thing about Ben is that she was the first professional female writer that England had known before, which means she wrote for leisure, she wrote because she loved writing, but at the same time, she also wrote for occasion, and she also wrote to make money. So she was a very interesting, a very talented, and a very clever woman who has very interestingly gone away from biographical discovery, and people are still trying to learn more things about her. These are some of the important works, some of the most well-known works that Ben has written, which include The Rover, The Emperor of the Moon, etc. This is just so that you know what she looks like. This is one of the portraits of hers which are available. Moving on, we come to the poem. To the Fair Clarinda is not a very long poem. It's not a poem that is difficult to learn, but it is a piece of writing which offers a lot of possibility for trying to understand it in multiple ways. Like any literary work, we cannot understand a literary work from a single perspective alone, because that can be limiting, and that kind of stops the way the literary work has the capacity to grow through the people who are reading them. So this is one such poem which gives you so much space to discover, so much space to explore, and to make so many conclusions or as many opinions as you can, because it evades being defined. That is the beauty of the poem in itself. Now, to move on to the lines. To the fair Clarinda, who made love to me imagined more than woman. Fair lovely maid, or if that title be too weak, too feminine for nobler thee, permit a name that more approaches truth, and let me call thee lovely, charming youth. This last will justify my soft complaint, while that may serve to lessen my constraint, and without blushes I the youth pursue, when so much beauteous woman is in view. Right from the beginning, the poet tries to talk about a woman called Clarinda. I said woman, but nowhere in the poem is the gender or sexual identity of Clarinda mentioned. A lot of studies say that she is a hermaphrodite or she is a trans individual, but all these details are completely up to the opinion of the person who's reading it. So the poet wants to call Clarinda many things: lovely, charming youth, fair, lovely maid, because she thinks one term is not enough to cover the beauty of someone incredibly beautiful like Clarinda. So Clarinda evades definition. Clarinda evades being defined in terms of gender, in terms of sexuality, in terms of her preferences. All we know is that Clarinda is beautiful, and the poet is very much in love with Clarinda, is still learning about the kind of person Clarinda is biologically, spiritually, physically, etc., in all dimensions of a human life. And that is what makes Clarinda even more beautiful to someone like the poet. So here, Clarinda evades definitions, Clarinda evades norms of social understanding of human identity, and Clarinda goes beyond these limitations. Against thy charms we struggle but in vain, with thy deluding form thou givest us pain. While the bright nymph betrays us to the swain, in pity to our sex sure thou wert sent, that we might love and yet be innocent, for sure no crime with thee we can commit. Or if we should, thy form excuses it. For who that gathers fairest flowers believe a snake lies hid beneath the fragrant leaves. Now this particular stanza tries to take our attention to Clarinda's physicality, Clarinda's sexuality and gender orientation. And as we move forward, it just keeps on getting even more vague. It kind of goes away from all sorts of definitions of trying to understand a human being as either this or that, because that in itself is a great limitation to human identity. Here, the poet is trying to say, I am trying to understand you, but I'm struggling, but this struggle is in vain. I cannot understand who you are. With you, no crime can be committed, or if should, thou form excuses it. This is a reflection of the ideas and ideals of morality which were deeply built into the society at the time Afra Ben wrote the poem. To say something, to add something about the poem, this was very modern when it was written. And it was something that had the capacity to anger a lot of people because it was explicit in its understanding of love, because it tried to broaden the horizon of what we understand as gender identity or sexual identity. And that is what is reflected in these couple of lines that I read out right now. And to the last few lines. Thou beauteous wonder of a different kind, soft chloris with the dear Alexis joint. Whenever the manly part of thee would plead, thou tempts us with the image of the maid, while we the noblest passions do extend, the love to Hermes, Aphrodite, the friend. In Clarinda, the poet sees both Hermes and Aphrodite. In Clarinda, the poet sees Alexis and Chloris. In Clarinda, the poet sees everything that a human being can be. And by evading this definition of gender and sexual identity, Clarinda is not limited by the problems of morality which the society had tried to suffocate people with. Society had, for a long period of time, even during the time Afra Ben herself wrote, was delimiting to a point where people were not open about their gender, sexual, or physical identities. And because of that, this poem in itself was a huge problem when it was written, like any poetry that tries to ask uncomfortable questions would. So, this is the poem, in a sense. It's a very short poem, it's very enjoyable, a very beautifully written work of literature, which provides you with a lot of capacities. It tries to make you understand that no matter how much we try, identity of human beings and everything that encompasses it are things that we are constantly learning on the process. And to call things black and white or this or that is always limiting and always unfair to someone who refuses to stick to this binary. Because understanding the world in terms of binaries is always limiting, is always unfair, and it is not inclusive to see the world like that. So, to come to the concluding points of this class, I would just like to point out some important things about the poem in general. It is playful, erotic, and candid. The poem written in the 1600s has surprisingly modern sensibilities. Like I said, to talk about multiple gender and sexual identities back in the 1600s was a feat in its own, was something that created a lot of problems, a lot of criticism Afra Ben had received for this because she was brave enough or courageous enough to tread into dangerous waters. But it paid off because the poem that came out of it is incredibly beautiful and we are still studying it right now in the 21st century. The sexual or gender orientations of Clarinda are up to discussion. Clarinda plays the masculine and feminine roles in the relationship, and this has nothing to do with anatomy or biology. In literature, we try to expand a lot on what it means to have an identity, what are the different aspects that constitute this word identity. And here, when you say, or when the poet says that Clarinda is both masculine and feminine in this relationship, it does not associate to the binary understanding of anatomy or biology that is often associated with human beings. It goes beyond that. It tries to give it a spiritual, a physical, and an emotional side to it as well. So you can analyze this, you can understand what it means or what it entails in your own way. And the subjectivity of this point is the beauty of the poem in itself. When you try to define Clarinda, when you try to restrict the idea that the poet has given about the freedom that she associates with Clarinda and whoever Clarinda is or whatever Clarinda or whoever she identifies or he or they identify as, that is the beauty of this poem, and that evades the binaries of anatomy and biology. Despite this, the poem can be discussed for Afra Ben associates specific natures with the masculine and specific features with the feminine. This is adherence to gender bias and breaking it simultaneously. Now, this is probably the most interesting part about learning to the fair Clarinda. On the one hand, Afra Ben tries to throw light on the bias or the prejudice or the suffocating binaries that society was trying to fit human beings into. And she achieves that by saying that Clarinda is everything. Clarinda is that and this and everything else. And it is at the same time a breaking of binaries and saying that human identity can never be expressed or explained through the limitations of a black or white binary. And at the same time, she also associates very specific characteristic features to the masculine and very specific characteristic features to the feminine. And that is a bias in itself. So at the same time, she breaks stereotypes, but she also adheres to it, which is a very complex space, a very interesting space that offers a lot of scope for study, understanding, reading up, and trying to analyze the way society understands identity. Because you know that Ben probably grew up in an environment like that by herself, where she has taken in a lot of social understandings of morality and social understandings of identity. And that understanding, no matter how much she tries to break it, sort of seeps through and can be reflected in her poem. And that is up to a lot of subjective discussions. And finally, the poem is explicitly sexual and filled with powerful images of physical and emotional love. The various dimensions of love, both physical, spiritual, emotional, etc., are in detail discussed in the poem, and that is the heart and the beauty of this literary work. It is very candid, it is very playful, open. It is the poem of someone who's trying to understand the person she is in love with and the identity of the person she is in love with, and it is a constant process of discovery. So it is not just a commentary on the way identity has been created and understood by a prejudiced society, but at the same time, it is also an understanding, a deeper insight into how it affected people and the way in which they understood how identities worked. So this is an overall quick understanding, a brief explanation of what Afroben's To the Fair Clarinda is. But I would like to say that this is a subjective reading of the poem that I have created, and this poem offers a lot of subjectivities like any piece of literary work does. If it is fixed to one meaning, then literature limits itself from achieving the maximum amount of growth that it can go to, which is a constantly evolving and growing process. So this is my subjective opinions that I was able to draw from the poem, and some of the aspects of the poem that the reader or the person who's studying it can find it interesting. And you should also offer yourself up to understanding the poem in a subjective manner and try to understand what exactly the poet means when she says that she's in love with Clarinda, who Clarinda is. Or maybe we don't have to understand that, because the moment we define Clarinda, the beauty of the poem is lost. So I hope that was a fruitful session. I hope that made sense, and I hope it gives you curiosity enough to go back and read To the Fair Clarinda by Afroben. Thank you.